Hello again, Year 8, and welcome to your next history lesson about the Conscientious Objectors in World War One. Now, if you've been able to do this lesson as a live lesson, you will have done a live starter activity with your teacher in your team's live introduction. However, if you're working on this on the Friday or the Monday in which you were working independently, then you won't have done the live starter, but that's fine. You just need to continue with the rest of the lesson. So let's make a start. First of all, remember to pause the video when I ask you to, because you will need to do that to complete the tasks. And remember that you can go back if you need to hear something again as well. So first of all, Year 8, I'd like you to put as your title for today, what happened to people that refused to fight? Now, we've done a lot of work looking at recruitment of soldiers in the First World War, and we have talked a bit about some of the reasons why soldiers did sign up. What we're going to be looking at today is what happened to those people that did refuse to fight for whatever reason. You may want to pause the slide now just so you can write that title down in your books or on your paper. So first of all, we need to identify what is a conscientious objector. So conscientious objectors were basically people who simply did not want to fight in the First World War. These people became known as conchies or COs for short. But the conscientious objector is basically a term that refers to anybody that refused to fight. They are also a sign that not everybody was enthusiastic about signing up and fighting in the war as the government would have liked. We know that the government put in a lot of different measures to encourage people to sign up and fight voluntarily, particularly at the beginning of the First World War. We also know that they did put in some measures to make men feel guilty about not signing up. But what we're going to be looking at today is why men decided not to sign up even after all of the efforts put in by the government to encourage them to do so, and what actually happened to them as well. Now, what I've just listed on the screen here for you for number 1, 2 and 3 are different reasons for why people decided not to fight in the First World War. So the first example is that people were pacifists. Now, pacifists are people that are just against war in general and violence, and basically they would refuse to fight because of their beliefs in that. The second one is to do with political objection. So some people decided that actually German people were not their enemy, the German government was not their enemy, and therefore they wouldn't sign up to fight for that reason. Some people were also religious objectors, and they actually believed that fighting and war was against their religion, and so quite frankly would refuse to fight. So what I'd like you to do for your first task today, and you will want to pause the slide in a second to do this. First of all, your first task is to write down what a conscientious objector is. You don't need to copy this directly from the screen, but you can just write down in your own words what your understanding is of a conscientious objector. Task number 2 is to write down the 3 different reasons for why somebody would perhaps refuse to fight in the First World War. So pause this slide here so that you can complete the task. For our next task, we're going to be looking at a letter from a conscientious objector. Now, ultimately, whilst you're reading this, you need to be thinking about reasons why this particular person refused to fight in the First World War. We're going to read through it together, and I'm going to ask you then to pause the video whilst you summarise the points that you've picked out in your books or on your paper. I will then go through some key things with you afterwards. So let's start by reading the letter through together. It states, "A month ago, Europe was a peaceful group of nations. If an Englishman killed a German, he was hanged. Now, if an Englishman killed a German, or if a German killed an Englishman, he was a proud flag waver. We scan the newspapers with greedy eyes for news of slaughter, and rejoice when we hear of innocent young men blindly going, as they were told to by the word of command, mown down in thousands by the machine gun of Liege, a town in Belgium. Those who saw the London crowds during the nights leading up to the declaration of war saw a whole population go from peaceable and humane to cruelty in just a few days, letting loose in a moment the instincts of hatred and bloodlust against which the whole fabric of society has been raised." So this is a conscientious objector talking about his reasons for why he decided not to join up the First World War army and why he decided to refuse to fight. So what I'd like to do now is just pause this video for a second whilst you pick out and write down the reasons that this person refused to fight. Okay, so hopefully you've had a think about some of these points for yourself. I'm just going to highlight a few key things that I would pick out if I was you as well, just in case some of you are struggling. So one of the things that I thought was important about the kind of key message here is about the real switch in attitudes. So, for example, it talks about how an Englishman would kill a German and would be hanged. Now, what that's suggesting is that if an Englishman killed a German, before the First World War broke out, it was considered murder. And so that person would suffer a penalty related to that, which at this time could be hanging. Now, on top of that, it also suggests that the attitude has completely changed, because now if an Englishman kills a German, he is a proud flag waver. Now, what that's suggesting is that people are now praising murder. People are suggesting that an Englishman murdering a German is in some way good for the country. And he's really confused about how that has switched. Why all of a sudden is it okay or even praised to murder somebody? He also talks about the fact that people at this time are reading newspapers with greedy eyes looking for slaughter. And he also talks about innocent young men blindly doing as they were told by the world of command. Now, I think what he's kind of referring to there is that people are looking in the newspapers to see how many German people have been killed in a certain battle, for example, looking for slaughter. And also at this time, sending young men to their deaths, as they did, sending men over the top of the trenches into no man's land, which we know was deadly. Thousands and thousands of men were mown down by machine guns every single day. And so, in that sense, you know, this person is questioning, why is that happening? Why are these young men blindly going to their deaths? Going to their deaths because they're being told to, which he seems to find strange. The people are essentially losing their lives because their government has told them to fight for something that they don't really know anything about, perhaps. So ultimately, he's talking about the innocence, he's talking about people blindly doing as they're told, and actually kind of suggesting that this war has no real meaning. It also talks about the fact that generally the population has gone from peaceable to cruelty in just a few days. It also talks about kind of instincts of hatred and bloodlust. And again, we could kind of see that, couldn't we, particularly through the stories of German cruelty, where the British newspapers are kind of encouraging people to hate German soldiers and to kind of, in some ways, you know, it does create that bloodlust, doesn't it? Because it was kind of demonising German soldiers to encourage English soldiers or British soldiers to want to fight these men and in some cases kill them as well. So ultimately, guys, this person is clearly against war generally, but is particularly against this war because they feel that it kind of encourages people to see murder as a positive. And he's also talking about the fact that young men are blindly going to their deaths with no good reason. So I hope you've picked out some similar points. If you manage to get down something different, that's absolutely fine. That's just my interpretation, some of the things that I would pick out personally. Let's move on to the next task. Okay, so we've just looked at why some people would object to joining in the First World War, but now what we're going to be looking at is, would they be punished? And if so, what kind of punishments would they face? So we're going to do this through some sources. We're going to be looking at different sources and dividing them and putting our notes into different categories on a chart. And let me explain that to you on the next slide. Okay, so over the next couple of slides, we're going to be looking at some different sources about how people were treated if they refused to fight in the First World War. The sources are going to be on the next few slides, so all you have to do is obviously keep watching the video and pause it when I tell you to. But for now, before you get started on looking at the sources, you do need to make sure that you've got a chart created in your books. So remember, just like usual, you need to do your one line across and one line down, and then basically we're going to be bullet pointing on either side of our chart. What you also need to make sure that you've got is the subheadings. On one side of your chart, you need to put emotional punishments. On the other side of your chart, you need to put physical punishments. Now, what this means is that if the punishments are there to humiliate or, you know, embarrass or make kind of people feel guilt-ridden, then obviously that is going to be an emotional punishment in some way. Whereas a physical punishment is kind of harming an individual, possibly even killing an individual because of their refusal to fight. So you're going to decide over the next few slides which sources would fit in each different category. So you will need to look at the sources carefully. In some cases, the sources do talk about physical and emotional, and in that situation, you would have to write a point for each. Now, obviously, once you have done this, I would then like you to write a paragraph in your books about which of the sources had shocked you the most and why. But I'll remind you of that later on in the video. First of all, pause this video now so that you can make sure that you've got your chart down before we get started looking at the sources. Okay, so we've got sources A and B on this slide, first of all. So this one is source A in this box here, and then source B is this picture here. Okay, there's a description of that next to it as well. So let's have a look at source A together, first of all, because I like to always do one with you, and then the rest of them you can have a look at on your own. So I'm just going to read through source A out loud for you now. So certainly several of IWM's, now that's the Imperial War Museum's interviewees, experienced or witnessed very harsh treatment and and 73 COs died as a result of physical abuse. The primary punishment, in many cases the most severe, was psychological rather than physical. The most fortunate COs were those who could devise ways to cope with loneliness, doubt, depression, and loss of ability to concentrate. Now, first of all, that does tell us quite a harrowing image, doesn't it, of how people were treated if they refused to fight in the First World War. It talks actually about both physical and emotional abuse. So what I'd like to make sure that you've got down, first of all, is an example of the physical abuse. So what you would do is on the side of your chart where you've got physical, that's where you would do your first bullet point, and you would write down source A, tells me that, and then you pick out your point. So first of all, I would pick out the fact that it says that there was harsh treatment and 73 COs died as a result of physical abuse. Basically what that means is that 73 people were beaten to death, really, because they refused to fight in the First World War. So that is definitely a physical punishment. However, the source does also talk about the emotional punishments as well. So for example, it talks about how COs had to cope with loneliness, doubt, depression, and loss of ability to concentrate. And this would have largely been perhaps because of their treatment in terms of sometimes people were arrested, for example, spending time in kind of not like I suppose a bit like a camp, like a prison camp where you'd have to do like hard labour for 10 years. And within that, of course, there is that loneliness, there is that doubt, whether you've done the right thing, refusing to fight in the First World War, but also you would be lonely because perhaps in some cases your friends and family might distance themselves from you because you have refused to fight. So that is where actually there is that emotional side of the abuse as well, because people did feel a sense of loneliness if they didn't fight because they were kind of singled out in society as cowards. So that's source A. So remember guys, I would put 1 point in emotional about the loneliness, the doubt, the depression that kind of comes from being a conscientious objector and being punished. But also I would write down an example in the physical side and talk about how there was harsh treatment and 73 COs actually were beaten to death because they refused to fight. So we can make sure we've got an example for each one of those. Now, source B, you're going to have a look at on your own. You need to pay really close attention to this picture here. First of all, make sure that you look at these key things. So for example, the picture is called An Object Lesson, This Little Piggy Stayed at Home. What do you think that's saying? This little piggy stayed at home. Also, look at the pictures carefully. Father, brother, mother, sister, uncle, cousin. Look at the picture of those people. What are they doing? What is this man doing here? Look at who he is. So once you've had a look carefully at that picture, what do you think the message is there? And also, this poster would have been published for people to see. Therefore, do you think this, once you've figured out the message, what do you think this is? Do you think it is emotional punishment for COs, or do you think it's physical punishment? Have a little think and write down something in your charts. You're now going to have a look at sources C and D. Now, source C gives you a bit of interview information, which is here, and source D is basically a quote from the Daily Mail newspaper in 1916. So again, have a look at what these are saying and what do they tell us about the treatment of conscientious objectors. And again, I would like you to decide if this treatment is emotional punishment or is it more physical punishment. I'd like to pause this video now so you can read sources C and D carefully and then decide where they go on your chart. The next two sources are E and F. Both of these sources do have pictures. So this first photograph is from a modern textbook. There's also this information here. You need to help you with that as well. So this information will tell you a bit about who these men are and what they're doing in that picture. Source F is basically a cartoon called The White Feather. There's a bit of information about it here, but also make sure you have a look at the cartoon itself as well. Again, you need to make sure that you look at this information carefully and decide, does source E tell you about physical or emotional treatment of COs if they refuse to fight? And have a look at source F, is the picture and the information, and decide again, is that physical or emotional abuse in regards to not fighting in the First World War? Again, pause this slide to help you really pay attention to this and then decide which side of your chart each source goes on. Now that you've looked at each of the different sources, I just want you to complete this quick consolidation question. Now I'm asking you, which of the sources has shocked you the most and why? I mentioned this question a little bit earlier and I said I would come back to it. So now is the chance for you to have a go at answering this question and explaining why you feel the way you do. So you've looked at a number of different sources now, some which talk about the emotional treatment and the emotional abuse of conscientious objectors, and some of them have talked about the physical abuse and treatment of conscientious objectors. What I'd like you to do is just tell me which of these sources has really shocked you. Is there one that stood out that you perhaps thought, oh my gosh, I didn't realise that people were treated in this way? And just explain why that particular one stood out to you as quite a shocking piece of information. Now what I'm going to do is ask you to pause the video whilst you have a go at answering this question, and then you can continue with the tasks. Okay guys, you've now finished all of the activities regarding the sources. What I would now like you to do is your final task for today is to write a short, convincing speech. Now this speech doesn't have to be really long. It can be quite short, but it needs to be convincing and persuasive. The idea is that you need to now imagine that you're somebody at the time and you have to kind of argue about how you feel about the way that conscientious objectors are being treated. So you need to make it clear whether you support the way that conscientious are being treated or not. Now, in your speech, you've got to make sure that you're trying to convince your audience at the time. So this could be like 1916. You're speaking to a group of people and you've got to try and convince them about your point of view. So do you think they should believe that conscientious objectors should be treated in this way for not fighting in the First World War? Or are you going to argue that this was totally wrong and that conscientious objectors had their rights to object to fight in the First World War and they should not have been treated in this way? Once you've decided on your opinion that you're going to argue in this speech, you need to then think carefully about the language that you're going to use. Remember that you're going to try and persuade your audience to agree with your side of the argument. So it's really, really important that you try to include some evidence to back up what you're saying. You can't just tell people it's how you feel. You've got to back up why you feel that way. So use the sources to help you with that. Try and pick out some key information from the sources to support and convince your audience and tell them why conscientious objectors should or should not be treated in that way. Now, I've also placed a key word bank on the screen as well here. So what you can see is that the first set of words, they basically tell you some examples of how you can convey positivity and confidence to back up what you're saying. The other section tells you about some negative words that can be used to great effect when pulling apart the opposition. So, for example, if you were going to argue that conscientious objectors should be treated, should not be treated in this way, then you could talk about the treatment of conscientious objectors being cruel, outrageous. You could talk about it being quite shameful, that the government and people involved in this should be ashamed. But also, I suppose you could, if you were arguing that conscientious objectors should be treated in this way, then I suppose you could talk about it being quite offensive, that their actions, that perhaps offend certain people. You might talk about again it being quite shameful and cowardly not being involved. So ultimately, it's kind of your decision really how you're going to argue this, and it's also your decision how you use these words, but you need to try and use them effectively to make your argument as persuasive and convincing as possible. It would be really lovely if you could send your speeches to your teachers. We'd love to read them, and we can also send you some feedback about what we think of your speeches as well. So please do that. You can do it through Share My Homework, or you can do it through email. It's up to you. So thank you very much for listening, Year 8. That is your final task for today. I hope you enjoy having a go at writing this speech. You might want to pause this slide now whilst you do so, otherwise the video will end. Thank you very much for listening, and take care.